Hello, I'm so pleased to be here and to be able to thank Tom and Jan once again for organizing this wonderful series. So thank you very much. In this paper, I would like to present some provisional ideas about Herodotus' representations of the ravaging and plundering of cultivated land and produce, as distinct from his accounts of the alteration or destruction of natural features of the world, which have been so well examined in the works of scholars from Henry Immerwahr in the 1960s to Catherine Clark's 2018 monograph on Man and Nature in Herodotus. However, I do not mean to suggest that the devastation of cultivated land is a main theme in Herodotus. As far as I can tell, and even though Herodotus' language is sometimes quite vivid, wasting and plundering of farmland is not a central focus of any narrative, except perhaps for the brief story of Aleuates' attacks on Miletus in Book 1. Instead, in each account, it is part of Herodotus' examination of the hubristic character of the aggressors and is linked to other themes that show the careless pride of the attackers, especially the destruction of temples and other religious transgressions. This is not to say, on the other hand, that the matter is only incidental. Herodotus' presentation of the devastation of cultivated land and its consequences seems to display clear patterns. Our Herodotean plunderers frequently have irrational motivations for destroying the land of others, and nearly always fail to wrest concessions from the parties they plunder. Their plundering is punished by men, by the gods, or both, so that in Herodotus' devastation of land, a supposedly safer option than face-to-face battle carries with it severe long-term dangers. These themes bear a strong relation to the historical events of the period during which Herodotus was writing, and will inevitably introduce Thucydides' account of this period into our consideration. Let's begin with two narratives that frame the histories, namely the story of Xerxes' attack on Greece in books 7 and 8, and the story of Aleuates' attack on Miletus in book 1, before looking at the devastations of the Greeks in book 5. Possibly the most important Herodotean narrative in which devastation of cultivated land plays a role is the account of Xerxes' attack on Greece. The theme is introduced in the run-up to the invasion, where Xerxes' advisors, his cousin Mardonius and uncle Artabanus, paint opposing pictures of the relationship between the Persians and Greek land. In the famous throne room debate at the beginning of Book 7, Mardonius tempts the youthful King Xerxes to invade Greece by describing Europe as a rich and fertile land, replete with every kind of cultivated fruit tree, so beautiful that Xerxes alone deserves to possess it. And this is the first passage on your handout. Mardonius paints Europe as the paradise or court garden of a Persian noble. The most beautiful garden should, of course, belong to the king, who only needs to take possession. Once Xerxes has marshaled his huge forces and set out for Greece, Xerxes' uncle Artabanus offers an opposing view, warning Xerxes that the land, far from being the paradise Mardonius had advertised, was likely to become a bitter enemy. And the more bitter, as Xerxes was more successful. If no opposition sets itself up in your way, says Artabanus, the land will become more hostile the further you advance on each occasion, drawn irresistibly forward, for there is no satiation of good luck for human beings. And so I say that more territory over more time will create famine, even if no one opposes you. In Mardonius' description, the orchards had been a treasure waiting to be claimed. In Artabanus' warning, the land is an active force, stealing the army forward until it starves. Artabanus channels the image of Xerxes passing through Greece unopposed, eagerly advancing in order to add to the size of his conquest and succumbing to starvation when he has gone so far that he cannot supply his army. Xerxes' hunger for more will cause its opposite, famine. Artabanus is remembering the dangers faced by Xerxes' father, Darius, when he advanced against the nomadic Scythians. His paradigm is not quite applicable to Xerxes' campaign. As Chris Pelling has noted, his prediction of starvation will come true, just not in the way that he thinks. The terms in which Xerxes rejects this warning are interesting for our examination. Since Xerxes responds that the Persians will not have to trust nature as Darius did, but rather can confide in success precisely because they are attacking farmers rather than nomads. Indeed, says Xerxes, we who are certainly a match for the Greeks are journeying at the fairest season of the year. And having conquered all of Greece, we will return home, not having met with any famine or suffered anything else unpleasant. For one thing, we ourselves are traveling with a great supply of resources. For another, we shall have the grain of those whose lands and people we are attacking, since we are attacking plowing men and not nomads. Xerxes' apparently rational assessment of his future resources assumes victory, and with victory, the possession of sufficient and reliable goods, the products of plowing labor. His view seems practical and realistic, an answer both to Mardonius' lying exaggerations of Greek fertility and Artabanus' excessively anxious predictions, and reflects a recognition that farms, which have calculable resources, are different from and more valuable to the plunderer than uncultivated and unpredictable natural landscapes. Xerxes thus portrays himself to Artabanus, to himself, and to the reader as a rational plunderer, someone who understands the resources he will claim and is plundering to support other strategies for success. This brief exhibition of what might have been prudence is soon over. As Tom Harrison has noted, Xerxes' remark may suggest an awareness of the need for supplies and logistical planning, but it is not a concern that is sustained. Emily Barakwanoff also offers a fine study of Xerxes' vacillation between thoughtfulness and the rash willfulness displayed during Xerxes' expedition to Greece, which shows no concern at all for calculating the resources of farmers and farmland. The well-known account of Xerxes' invasion of Greece will hopefully bear a brief retelling in order better to compare it to Herodotus' account of Euates' predations on Miletus. Xerxes banquets his way to Greece, reducing the cities in Persian-controlled territory to poverty. Required to feed the king and his army with everything they have, and going deep into debt to do so, the cities wake up the next morning to find that the Persian army has taken all movable property. As Herodotus says, they left nothing behind. This exploitation of those who had not resisted Xerxes' rule introduces his treatment of those parts of Greece that did resist, where his army destroys whatever comes within their reach. Once the Greeks have withdrawn after the Battle of Artemisium, the Persians overrun the territory of Histiaia. They spare Medizing Doris, but encouraged by their Thessalian allies, who were enemies of the Phocians, they ravage Phocia. The barbarians, writes Herodotus, overran all of Phocia, for the Thessalians were leading their army, and wherever they stopped, they burned and cut down everything and threw fire upon the cities and sanctuaries. They wreck everything in their path as they proceed southward. The god himself saves Delphi, but the destruction continues as Xerxes draws near to Athens. Soon we find that he has set fire to all of Attica and likewise destroyed Plataea and Thespis with fire as a punishment for their refusal to join Persia. Nor does the plundering of Attica end after the Persians lose the Battle of Salamis and Xerxes retreats back to Persia, but rather Mardonius in his turn considers Attica to be the possession of the Persian sphere and destroys it again when the Athenians refuse to concede during the winter after the Battle of Salamis. Xerxes, therefore, does not claim the present or future resources of Greek farmers in order to feed his army, but instead wreaks destructive revenge on those who have resisted Persia. Doing the rational thing, namely exploiting the farmers and the land, does not seem even to occur to him. Herodotus depicts the consequences. The practice of laying waste to everything as they proceeded southward backfires on the Persians, since it stiffens Greek and certainly Athenian determination and ultimately causes the starvation of Xerxes' own forces. Herodotus' account of Xerxes' retreat northward after losing the Battle of Salamis shows his forces seizing the crops of friends and enemies alike, as well as eating the grass and the bark and the leaves of the trees as they die of dysentery and hunger, punished for their master's hubris. This starvation fulfills Artabanus' predictions and annuls the banqueting the Persians had enjoyed during their invasion when they proceeded southward on this same path, leaving nothing behind. Likewise, it shows the desperate Persians trying and failing to survive on the leaves and bark of the trees Mardonius had advertised as lush, productive, and easy to acquire. An alternative plan of plundering Greece had been offered. Demaratus had advised Xerxes to occupy the island of Kythera and to ravage the Spartans from there, which would have split the Spartans against each other and allowed Xerxes to conquer the Greeks piecemeal. Demaratus' advice was rejected when the Persians decided that it was too risky to divide up their navy. As later events were to prove, however, and as Herodotus readers knew very well, this was a plan that might have worked. It reminds us inescapably of Athens' Peloponnesian War occupation of Kythera, from which the Athenians indeed plundered and terrified the Spartans. Let us try for a moment to hold off the inescapable and to consider Herodotus' presentation without too much feeling the shadow of the more prominent role of the devastation of cultivated land in Thucydides. On to Aleuates. Similar in its structure to Herodotus' account of Xerxes' invasion, although not in its atmosphere, is a story from close to the beginning of Book 1. Aleuates, king of Lydia and a serial attacker of his neighbors, has inherited from his father a war to conquer Miletus. Like his father, he attacks annually when the crops are ripe, making a festival of it by bringing a band of flutes and pipes to accompany the work. He takes the fruit and crops, but leaves the farmhouses intact. The whole business goes on for 11 years, since the Milesians, for their part, rule the sea in their area. There's no mention that they pay any attention to the annual invasions, so that the flautists and pipers seem quite secure. As we see from this 6th passage on your handout, Aleuates' aim in preserving the farmhouses was to afford the Milesians the basis for sowing their crops every year, so that he will always have something to plunder. His annual plundering therefore goes on. Although the Lydians twice defeat the Milesians in battles fought elsewhere during this period, the Milesians don't give up. In the 12th year of these incursions, the invaders accidentally set fire to a temple of Athena as they are burning the crops. Aleuates falls ill, inquires at Delphi, and finds that the Pythia will not answer him until this temple is rebuilt. He therefore sends a messenger to Miletus to ask for a truce during which to rebuild the temple. This message is the opportunity that Thrasbulus, the tyrant of Miletus, required. As Tom Harrison has noted, Thrasbulus is one of Herodotus' tricksters. Bringing out the supplies stored in the city, Thrasbulus has the citizens drink and celebrate while Aleuates' messenger is in Miletus. The messenger then reports back to Aleuates that the Milesians are feasting and thus fulfills Thrasbulus' plan, since Aleuates had expected that the Milesians would by this time be reduced to misery and starvation. Defeated in this expectation, he gives up the war and makes peace and an alliance with Miletus. This is handout number 7 here, excuse me. I've briefly summarized this happy end story, which has some fantastic and ironical aspects. It predicates, for instance, that if a plunderer leaves the buildings on the land, the farmers will come back and plant crops, even though they know that their own army will not defend the land against annual invasions, and even though there's food in the city for 12 years in a row. The implausibility of this scenario leads us to suspect that Herodotus is telling a story in which the Milesians were the whole time allowing Aleuates and his father to prosecute attacks they thought were clever and harmful in order to distract them from planning the more harmful battles. Thrasbulus had perhaps been a trickster from the beginning. Moreover, the structure of the story is folktale perfect. In the end, Aleuates' excessively musical plundering parties are answered and cancelled out by Thrasbulus' festival in the presence of Aleuates' messenger. Another fantastic element of this story is that neither side is seriously harmed by the devastations. This is a story about the plundering of crops in which no one goes hungry and the attackers are not seriously punished. The narrative of Xerxes' campaign and Aleuates' attacks on Miletus the narratives of Xerxes' campaign and Aleuates' attacks on Miletus show opposing possibilities, since in one story, both sides suffer grievous harm, and in the other, neither side does. However, both Xerxes and Aleuates, having inherited a war, aggressively invade. Both commit religious infractions, destroying temples as they plunder. In both stories, the plunderers' initial festive exploitations are decisively answered, Xerxes by starvation, Aleuates by mockery. Most important, in both stories, the plundering of cultivated land fails to wrest concessions from the attacked. Indeed, in Aleuates' story, the plundering seems to be practically an activity the Milesians have set up to occupy Aleuates. So much for some interpretive ideas about these stories that cleave entirely to the connections internal to the text of Herodotus. However, Thucydides, who began his account of each of the first years of the Archidemian War by showing that the Athenians had planted their crops, even though the Spartans were probably coming back to ravage them, and even though they knew that their army would not defend the land, and even though there was food in the city, because like the Milesians, they were masters of the sea, now springs inescapably to mind. I would be happy to hear what anyone else may have to say about this story. To me, it seems to present an alternative universe in which Pericles' policy for Athens succeeds perfectly. Instead of suffering the results the Athenians endured when they stayed behind their walls during the Spartan invasions of Attica, namely intense pain and anxiety, deaths of defenders, the plague, etc., the Milesians fulfill Pericles' policy and prevail without apparently suffering at all from the ravaging of their crops. Most important, because it throws doubt on the soundness of the strategy of ravaging land, is the resemblance between the outcomes. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta fails to win concessions from Athens by ravaging Attica. Likewise, Aleuates and Xerxes' devastations both failed to compel concessions. I'm not having much success avoiding the shadow of Thucydides. However, we did note some internal similarities between the Aleuates and Xerxes stories, which show overconfident plundering that leads to religious infractions and failure to conquer. Interesting, and I believe little noticed, is Herodotus' implication that an opponent's plan to ravage the land, or his known tendency to do so, can be used against him. Let's proceed to the Greeks in Book 5. Let's see. Just get this up here. Herodotus does not limit the theme of futile devastation of cultivated land to non-Greeks. Some Greek examples are mentioned in the footnotes and appendices to this paper. The main Greek example is in the central sections of Book 5, where the Spartans, Chalcidians, Thebans, and Aeginetans make repeated incursions into Attica, but failed to prevent the growth of Athens and the development of Athenian democracy. Once again, therefore, plundering fails to gain concessions and even backfires, making the object of the attacks stronger. Moreover, perhaps even more than in his accounts of Xerxes' invasions of Greece or Aleuates' attacks on Miletus, in Book 5, Herodotus foregrounds the Greek state's passionate motivations for wasting someone else's land and, in respect to the smaller powers, their imprudence in doing so. Devastation as a tactic is therefore defeated in Book 5, as well as in our other examples. In this way, as well as others, the Greeks' quarrels in Book 5 point to the opening events of the Peloponnesian War. It is impossible for me here to do justice to the complex account contained in Book 5. I must refer you to Elizabeth Irwin and Emily Greenwood's 2007 volume on reading Book 5 and to Simon Hornblower's 2013 commentary on Book 5 as starting points for filling in the huge amount of important information I must pass over. The part of Book 5 most relevant to our investigation begins when the Spartans are tricked into expelling Athens' Pisistrated tyrants in 511 and 510 BCE. Athens' growing post-tyranny power and independence soon causes the Spartans to change their minds. And when King Cleomenes' first attempt to overthrow the democracy and install his candidate Isagoras fails, he raises a large army to attack again. As passage 8 on your handout shows, Herodotus makes it clear that the motivations for this second attack are anger arising from a sense of insult and the desire for revenge. Like Xerxes, Cleomenes is determined to punish the Athenians for their hubris, that is, their resistance to his rule. Cleomenes wastes Eleusis while the Boeotians capture borderland Demes and the Chalcidians devastate other areas of Attica. However, Cleomenes' large army evaporates so that he is forced to abandon the attack and go home. Cleomenes' retreat does not happen soon enough to prevent him from committing the religious infraction that causes his later madness, at least according to the Athenians, since during this invasion, he devastated not only the land, but also the precincts of the Temple of Demeter at Eleusis. Once the Spartans have gone home, the Athenians take up the motivation of vengeance. Because they want to pay back the Spartans' Boeotian and Chalcidian accomplices, they attack both, defeating them in battle. They take many captives and charge a high ransom for their return. They also occupy Chalcidian land with 4,000 cleruches. Through their incursions, the Boeotians and Chalcidians have increased rather than diminishing Athens' power. In answer, the Boeotians take up the revenge theme. Determined to take revenge on Athens, the Thebans request help from the Aeginetans, who lay waste to Phalerum and other coastal demes of Attica, causing great damage. This is number 9 on your handout. Sorry. Herodotus lays stress on the fact that the Aeginetan attack is a surprise attack, an unannounced war, and on their motivations, overconfidence because of their present prosperity and a grievance against Athens resulting from an old quarrel, which Herodotus describes at length. In response to Aeginus' attack, the Athenians are about to go to war against Aegina in the same way as they had against the Thebans and Chalcidians, but are prevented when the Spartans pull up yet again for purposes of revenge, determined to reinstate the Pisistratids as tyrants over Athens in order to quell Athenian power and Athenian democracy for good. But they are, as we know, thwarted in this attempt as well. In sum, Athens takes successful revenge on the smaller powers who ravaged her lands at the requests of greater powers, such as the Boeotians, Chalcidians, and Aeginetans are all doing. These smaller powers likely used the wasting strategy in the first place because their armies and navies, as subsequent events showed, were too weak to fight the Athenians face to face. Their provocation of Athens was therefore very dangerous in that they ravaged the lands of a power against whose military forces they were too weak to defend themselves. In particular, Athens will not rest until the Aeginetans are entirely annihilated. As Thucydides shows, they defeated and reduced the Aeginetans to subjects in 459-57, expelled them from their island in 431, and finally exterminated the people themselves in 424. These are events Herodotus and his readers would have experienced. Herodotus' emphasis on the fact that the Aeginetans fell on the Athenians with an unannounced war of ravaging, like pirates or robbers, is perhaps worth some attention, although I'm confused by this remark, since it seems like no one would ever announce a plundering expedition. Be this as it may, in the stories of Book 5 that we have just quickly reviewed, the smaller Greek states are even more imprudent than Xerxes, who does not risk the existence of his state when he devastates Attica. To conclude, we should briefly touch on Sparta. In the accounts from Book 5, the Athenians took revenge on Sparta's henchmen, but not on Sparta herself. And the Spartans seem to have relied on their invulnerability to attack in the post-Persian War period and beyond. Their strategy of using ravaging and threats of ravaging as a response to Athens' growth therefore continues. As very many of you know, the Spartans promised to devastate Attica in the late 460s and in 432. In between these promised devastations, which for various reasons did not come about, came the abortive invasion of King Pleistouanax in 446. In 431, the 5-ish Peloponnesian War devastations of Attica begin, only to be stopped only by Athens' victory over Sparta at Sphacteria in 425. But as soon as Athens returns the Spartan prisoners, Captured from this battle, the Spartans are back at it, threatening to invade Attica in order to encourage the Athenians to fulfill the terms of the Peace of Nicias. Just to finish the story, we should of course remember Sparta's more or less continuous devastations of Attica from Decelea, beginning from 413 until the end of the war. And as for the post-Peloponnesian War period, which Riedinger ironically called the golden age of Spartan devastation of land, see Xenophon's Hellenica and Riedinger, 1991. It would require another paper to delve into the Spartans' reasons for favoring this strategy, and I would tire you all with speculations. Suffice it to say that from Herodotus' point of view, all of this devastation, including even the more severe and persistent devastations carried out from Decelea after 413, cannot win the war for Sparta, although it can severely harm Athens' economy and social fabric. Writing in this historical context, Herodotus has given us accounts of devastations that fail to wrest concessions from those who are attacked, and which are undertaken for irrational reasons, usually the desire to punish and take revenge. Finally, those devastations frequently lead to religious infractions, and here I call to mind Sparta's devastation and destruction of Plataea, together with Sparta's subsequent pathetic attempts to trick out Plataea as a sacred site.